Of the show for today. But it is Dr. Forrest Harris, who is the president of American Baptist College. And of course, Dr. Harris, we're sort of confused in reference to whether we're dealing with the second of the segment or the third segment. But let's have you two continue our conversation earlier to talk about the civil rights movement and to talk about the separation of the races in the southern parts, well, the separation of the races that created that movement.
Yes, well, American Baptist College is a good example of how Southern culture and racism impacted black life, from religious life to economic and political life, is that blacks were not accepted on the same level and basis in community, in economic education institutions as were whites. And they were relegated to inferior lifestyles and less political and economic privileges. So what ended up happening was there were creations of institutions like American Baptist College for blacks to attend, and other interests in people establishing institutions where blacks could get training, like at Fisk and at Tennessee A&I at the time. But all these institutions represent an effort to have a place for blacks to be trained and to get education, separate and apart from white culture and white privilege and white power. But what ended up occurring in terms of the civil rights movement was that these places, though they were seen as inferior and treated differently and given less economic substance and support by the dominant culture, they ended up being incubators to produce some of the great leaders that we are celebrating today, and some of the great leadership that Nashville itself has experienced. And so segregation certainly affected the way in which our culture developed our communities. And that in itself proved to be a very, very hard thing in terms of the oppression that a lot of families, a lot of communities had to suffer, and therefore a lot of people who could have been educated, who could have reaped benefits from other accesses to other places, did not. And the poverty and the lack of education, the lack of jobs, all of that was a part of this segregated culture that the South, and particularly here in Nashville and other places, we saw happen. And it was a tragic time and a tragic history. But I'm always thinking, as I think about now, the civil rights movement and what it meant for the progression of black life and the progression of this nation towards social justice, is that it never meant for these communities to be eliminated, or these communities not to have a distinct contribution, but it meant that they ought to have equal access to the economic and political empowerment that the rest of the community had, in order that it might produce the kind of families, the kind of religious institutions and educational institutions that our community needs. And American Baptist College fits right into that vision, because it's not an inferior institution. It's not an institution that has less to offer than any other institution as it relates to theological and biblical education. But over the years, as a result of suffering from the lack of economic resources and support, it has not been able to reach its full potential. And so the civil rights movement in our city, in Nashville, has had a particular impact on opening up access to these various venues of political and economic power that has made our schools much more viable institutions for the future. And yet, because of that history of racism and isolated from resources, they still struggle with the need for support.
So support, for additional resources, et cetera. Now, looking at some of the support that you need to sort of generate for American Baptist College, what do you see as some of the major areas what are some of your primary objectives in terms of trying to raise more money for what you're doing?
Well, American Baptist College deserves the support of the Nashville community because of what it contributed to the community. If there had not been an American Baptist College, we would not be as far advanced and progressive in social justice, because the student leadership of that college helped this community come to see and understand its need to be inclusive and to treat everybody on an equal basis. So Nashville itself, I hope, will come to own the future of American Baptist College in a way that it will support it. We are developing a capital fundraising campaign for the college.
Yeah.
And in doing so, we pledged to raise $1 million by the end of this academic year. Excuse me. And in that campaign, we want to launch it by establishing a commission on the future of American Baptist College. And many of the people who will serve on this commission are persons in Nashville, leaders in Nashville and around the country who can help us understand how we might develop strategic steps toward the revitalization of American Baptist College. One area that needs to be revitalized is its academic support systems. For a long time, our academic support systems have not had the kind of resources that will improve our academic standing and make us competitive in appealing and attracting students to our campus. Secondly, we have to deal with our grounds and buildings. The deferred maintenance of our campus has been neglected too long, to the extent now that we don't have any options but to give attention to how we will house the college, which means that we have to give attention to and emphasis on what we can do to build new buildings or renovate those that exist, but expand as well. Library services, academic services, student services. Our students are in vital need of student housing in a way that is adequate. We have improved that somewhat, but we have a long ways to go in order to provide the kind of student environment on the campus for people to come. And then we need endowment. We need endowment. The school does have a modest endowment, very modest, nothing that would compare to the Vanderbilts or the Tennessee States here in our city, but an endowment nonetheless of near $1 million as a result of separate endowments that people have given to the school. But we have to give some real strategic thinking to how we can build the endowment of the school to ensure its future on into the next century. And we feel really excited at this point because of the new leadership of the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated, Dr. William Shaw, and of course my coming on as leader of the college as president, that together we can begin to rally the convention itself and our constituents and other people, non-traditional funding sources, to build the endowment of this school. One of the other visions that we have, Dr. Haney, is though we are a theological and biblical school for the theological education of leaders, we know that the trend now is more interdisciplinary, and we want to bring interdisciplinary courses and academics to the theological and biblical curriculum that we have, so that students can have training in Christian ethics and biblical studies.
Very good. And of course, Doctor, let me interrupt you here for this final commercial break, and we'll be back with you following this short commercial break. College and the Civil Rights